The snow began as a whisper against the gray canvas of the Wyoming sky, a fine, hesitant powder that clung to the brim of Clara Wynn's hat and the weary shoulders of her woolen coat. For 3 days, the land had been a relentless panorama of muted browns and dying ochres, the vast, unforgiving plains stretching out until they blurred into the base of the distant, tooth-edged mountains. Now, white was beginning to claim the world, softening the harsh lines of the earth but adding a deeper, more penetrating chill to the air. Her horse, a sturdy buckskin mare named Juniper, plodded onward with the steady, uncomplaining rhythm of a creature who knew its only job was to move forward. Clara's body ached in time with that rhythm, a deep, resonant ache that had settled in her bones weeks ago and now felt like a permanent part of her. She was tall for a woman, with a frame that was not delicate but durable, built by a life that had demanded more than it had given. Her face, framed by strands of dark brown hair that had escaped their tight bun, was drawn and pale with fatigue, but her eyes, a clear, sharp gray like a winter river, held no hint of surrender. They simply watched, observed, and calculated the distance to the next horizon. This horizon, finally, was different. It held the faint, smudged promise of smoke rising in thin columns. Ash Bluff. The name had been a murmur in a dusty way station, a suggestion from a freighter heading east while she headed west. A hard town, he'd said, spitting tobacco juice near her boots, but an honest one. They don't care where you came from, so long as you can pull your own weight. That was all she wanted. The past was a heavy cloak she had shed somewhere back in Nebraska, leaving it for the coyotes and the wind. With it, she'd left the name Thorn. She was Clara Wynn again, the name she was born with, a name that belonged to no one but herself. The memory of her marriage was not a sharp, painful wound, but a dull, cold stone in her gut. It had been a bargain, struck by her father after a poor harvest had left them destitute. Elias Thorne was a man of property, twice her age, with a gaze that assessed everything from livestock to women with the same detached eye for value. He had offered security, a roof that didn't leak, a pantry that was never bare. In return, he had required a wife, a signature on a deed, a body in his bed, a silent presence at his dinner table. Her first night as Mrs. Thorne had set the tone for the 2 years that followed. There had been no gentle words, no tentative touch of discovery. He had come to her in the dark, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the unfamiliar room. The act itself was swift, silent, and impersonal, a claiming of property, a sealing of a contract. He had not used her name. He had not kissed her. When he was finished, he had rolled away from her and fallen asleep, his breathing even and untroubled, leaving her to lie awake, staring at the ceiling and feeling the profound, hollow emptiness of the promise of safety. It was not a violation of the flesh that haunted her, but the utter annihilation of the spirit. It had no meaning. That night, it was a transaction devoid of tenderness, a debt paid. And in that cold, silent room, Clara Wynn had learned her final, bitter lesson about men and their promises. They were not shelters from the storm. They were often the storm itself. Elias had never been cruel in the way of a fist or a raised voice. His cruelty was one of omission. He erased her with his indifference. He looked through her, spoke around her, and conducted his life as if she were another piece of furniture he had acquired. She had tried, in the beginning, to find some crack in his cold facade, some glimmer of the man he might be beneath the layers of stern pragmatism. She had cooked his favorite meals, mended his shirts with the tiniest, most perfect stitches, and kept his house with a quiet efficiency that should have earned at least a nod of approval. She received nothing. Her existence was acknowledged only by the plate he left for her to clear and the space he occupied on the other side of the bed. The end had been as quiet and bloodless as the beginning. A cousin of his had come to visit, a woman from the East with soft hands, a tinkling laugh, and a way of looking at Elias that was both deferential and cunning. Clara saw the shift immediately. He began to notice things: the way Delilah's dress swished when she walked, the tilt of her head when she listened to his pronouncements on politics and cattle prices. He began to speak to Delilah, to smile at her, and in doing so, he made Clara's invisibility complete. He had informed her of his decision one evening. After Delilah had discreetly retired, he stood by the hearth, not looking at her. "It is not working," he'd said, his voice flat. "This arrangement, I will be seeking an annulment. Delilah has agreed to take your place." There was no room for argument. He was not asking. He was stating a fact, like announcing the time of day. He gave her a small purse of coins, a final, insulting payment, and told her to be gone by morning. He had found a better asset. The old one was to be discarded. She had packed a small satchel, taken the horse he had given her as part of the original marriage bargain, the only thing that had ever shown her a flicker of warmth, and ridden out before the sun rose. Not looking back, she was a Goapu Kong Chong, a husbandless widow, a woman with the mark of marriage, but without the man or the standing it was supposed to provide. Now, the smokestacks of Ash Bluff grew clearer, resolving into the shapes of cabins and buildings hunkered down against the encroaching winter. The town was nestled in a shallow dip in the plains, a collection of raw timber and hopeful grit. As she rode closer, she could make out the spire of a wooden church, stark against the darkening sky, and the wider, more solid shape of what had to be a saloon, a faint yellow light already glowing in its windows. Juniper's hooves fell silent as they moved from the frozen earth onto the town's single, wide main street, a stretch of mud hardened by the cold. And the looking began. A man chopping wood by a cabin paused, his axe held mid-swing, his eyes lingering on her. A curtain twitched in the window of the general store. Two women, wrapped in thick shawls, stopped their conversation and turned as one, their faces pinched with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A lone woman arriving in the first snow of the season, without a man to ride beside her, was an event. She was an anomaly, a question mark. Clara kept her chin up, her gaze fixed on the far end of the street. She had learned from Elias that to look down was to admit shame, and she would not give this town, or any person in it, the satisfaction. She sat tall in her saddle, the weariness in her bones masked by a rigid spine. Let them look. Let them whisper. Their judgments were weightless compared to the cold stone of her own experience. She had survived Elias Thorne's suffocating silence. She could certainly survive the curious stares of strangers. She saw the livery stable, a large, barn-like structure with a faded sign swinging in the wind. She guided Juniper toward it, the mare's ears twitching, sensing the promise of shelter and oats. As Clara dismounted, her stiff limbs protesting, a man emerged from the barn's shadowy interior. He was older, with a beard the color of dirty snow and eyes that had seen too many winters. Looking for a stall, he grunted, his gaze flicking from her to the horse, assessing the mare's condition with a practiced eye. "And a place to board her for a while?" Clara said, her voice a little rough from disuse. "She's a good horse, doesn't spook easy." The man ran a hand down Juniper's flank. "Looks sound. Where you headed?" It was the question she had been dreading, the one that always led to more questions. "Here," she said simply. The stableman raised an eyebrow. "Here, nobody heads for Ash Bluff. It's a place you pass through or get stuck in." He looked at her again, at the worn coat, the lack of extensive baggage, the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes. "You got people here?" "No." "Husband coming along later?" "No," she repeated, the word coming out as flat and hard as a slammed door. He seemed to accept that, or at least to understand that no more information would be forthcoming. He spat a stream of brown juice. "All right, cost you 4 bits a day, hay and grain included. You can pay up at the end of the week." "Thank you," Clara said, her shoulders slumping with a fraction of released tension. She gave Juniper's neck a final, grateful pat before handing the reins over. As the stableman led the mare inside, Clara stood alone in the street, the snow now falling in earnest, melting on her cold cheeks like tears she no longer had the energy to shed. Her first night, it had been a contract. No affection, no name whispered in the dark, no consequences, except for the hollowing out of her soul. This night would be different. This night, she had paid for her own shelter with her own coin. She was a stranger, with no promises to keep and none to receive. It was a new beginning, born not of hope, but of the simple, stubborn refusal to end. And in the profound loneliness of Ash Bluff, under the silent fall of snow, that felt like enough. The first week in Ash Bluff was a study in the economy of survival. Clara spent her dwindling coins with the precision of a surgeon, trading them for a small room at the back of Mrs. Gable's boarding house, a loaf of bread, a small wedge of cheese, and oats for Juniper. The room was little more than a closet with a cot and a single window that looked out onto a muddy alley. At night, the sounds of the saloon boisterous laughter and the tinny lament of a poorly played piano filtered through the thin walls, constant reminders of a world of men she had no desire to rejoin. During the day, a fragile quiet descended, broken only by the wind whistling through the eaves and the ever-present internal clock counting down her resources. She was not idle. She spent the first 2 days mending the few garments she owned, her stitches small and even. A habit of carefulness ingrained in her from a young age. She walked the length of the town's main street a dozen times, taking its measure. She saw the general store, the land office, the doctor's small shingle hanging crookedly, the church and the saloon, and she saw the smithy. It was the heart of the town, a wide-mouthed structure of dark, soot-stained timber that pulsed with heat and sound. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil was the town's heartbeat, a steady, industrious percussion that spoke of work, of creation, of things being forged and mended. The smell of coal smoke and hot metal was sharp and clean, a scent of purpose that cut through the damp chill of the air. It was a man's world. She knew, but it was also a world of leather and tools, and that was a language she understood. Her father, before the hard times, had taught her to work leather, and at Elias Thorne's. Caring for the tack had been one of her few solitary duties, a task she had taken to with a quiet focus. On the morning of her 8th day in Ash Bluff, with only a few coins left in her purse, Clara pulled her coat tight, tied her hair back severely, and walked toward the sound of the hammer. Pushing open the heavy wooden door was like stepping into another climate. The air was thick with heat and smoke, a welcome shock after the biting cold outside. A massive forge dominated the back wall, its coals glowing with a furious orange light. Sparks flew as a broad-backed man, his face obscured by a leather apron and a sheen of sweat, brought a heavy hammer down on a piece of glowing iron. This was Mr. Croft, the blacksmith, a man whose grunts seemed to carry more meaning than most men's conversations. She waited patiently, standing just inside the doorway, allowing her eyes to adjust to the gloom. The shop was an organized chaos of metal tools, iron hoops, horseshoes, and pieces of harnesses in various states of repair. In a slightly cooler corner, a heavy workbench was dedicated to leather work. A half-finished saddle sat on a wooden stand, its intricate pieces waiting to be joined. That was her goal. When the blacksmith finally plunged the hot iron into a quenching barrel with a great hiss of steam, he turned and seemed to notice her for the first time. His eyes, small and shrewd under bushy gray eyebrows, took in her tall frame, her plain dress, and her determined expression. "What is it, miss?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. He wiped his face with the back of a grimy hand. "If you're looking for your husband, this ain't the saloon." "I'm not looking for a husband," Clara stated, her voice even. "I'm looking for work." Croft let out a short, humorless laugh. "Work? I'm the only smith in this town. Don't need an apprentice, especially not one in a skirt." "Not for the forge," she clarified, stepping forward into the firelight. "For the leather. Your saddle work. I can stitch a seam stronger and straighter than any man you've had. I can tool. I can mend. I can build a saddle from the tree up if you have the materials." His skepticism was a palpable thing, thick as the smoke in the air. He looked at her hands. They were clean, but not soft. Her knuckles slightly raw from the cold. Her fingers long and capable. That's bold talk for a woman who looks like the last good meal she had was a week ago. Clara didn't flinch at the personal remark. It was a statement of fact, not an insult. "Test me," she said. "Give me a piece of scrap leather and an awl. If my stitch isn't perfect, I'll leave and not trouble you again." For a long moment, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a shrug that seemed to say he had nothing to lose, he gestured with his head toward the leatherworking bench. "Over there, scrap bins underneath." Clara moved to the bench, her heart pounding a nervous, hopeful rhythm. This was her one chance. She rummaged in the bin and pulled out 2 thick, uneven pieces of saddle skirting. She took a sharp awl from the rack, its wooden handle smooth and familiar in her palm. She chose a needle and a length of waxed thread. She didn't sit, she stood at the bench, laying the 2 pieces of leather together, her movements efficient and sure. She punched the first hole with the awl, the tool sinking through the tough hide with a satisfying pop. Then the next, and the next, each one perfectly spaced. She threaded the needle and began to sew, her hands working in a practiced, fluid dance. The double-stitch saddle seam was a thing of strength and precision. It was not just about pulling thread through holes. It was about tension, about locking each stitch into the one before it, creating a bond that was stronger than the material itself. As she worked, she lost herself in the familiar motions, the world narrowing to the point of her needle, the scent of the leather, and the quiet satisfaction of making something whole and strong. She was so absorbed. She didn't hear the door open again. She didn't hear the soft jingle of spurs on the dirt floor. She only became aware of another presence when the light from the doorway shifted, a large shadow falling over her workbench. She looked up. Her hand paused in mid-stitch. A man stood there, taller than the blacksmith, with shoulders that seemed to strain the seams of his thick leather coat. A worn Stetson was pulled low on his brow, shadowing his face, but she could see the dark stubble on a square jaw and a mouth that was set in a firm, neutral line. A gun belt was slung low on his hips, the Colt revolver in its holster not a decoration, but a tool, as worn and practical as the blacksmith's hammer. He was the embodiment of the frontier lean, hard and self-contained. Her first instinct, born of her experience with Elias, was a tightening in her chest, a preparation for being dismissed or ignored. But this man's gaze was different. He had been watching her work, and now his eyes met hers. They were a startlingly clear blue, the color of a deep lake under a winter sky. Men had looked at her before. In her younger days, some had looked with interest. The men in Ash Bluff looked with suspicion and curiosity. Elias had looked with indifference. This man looked at her with an unnerving stillness, a quiet intensity that seemed to bypass all her outer defenses. It wasn't a look of appraisal, not in the way a man sizes up a woman or a horse. It was a look of recognition, as if he saw the tired lines around her eyes and understood the miles that had put them there, as if he saw the resolute set of her jaw and knew the weight of the silence she carried. He wasn't the first man to look twice, but he was the first who didn't look away. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the forge. Clara felt a strange heat rise to her cheeks, an unfamiliar discomfort at being so truly seen. She straightened up, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance that was purely instinctual. It was he who broke the silence, his voice a low baritone, calm and unhurried. "Your name." The question was direct, yet it held no demand. Clara's automatic defense rose up, a wall she had built brick by brick. A name was a handle, a way for people to take hold of you. Her married name had been an erasure. Her given name felt too private to offer up to a stranger in a dusty forge. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said, her tone clipped. The man's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something understanding perhaps passed through his blue eyes. He took a half-step closer, not in a threatening way, but simply to move out of the doorway's direct light. He gave a slow nod, his gaze sweeping once more over her determined face, then gesturing slightly with his chin toward the snow-dusted world outside. "Then I'll just call you the woman who dared to come to Ash Bluff in the snow." The words were so unexpected, so utterly different from anything she could have anticipated, that they disarmed her completely. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't flirting. He was simply stating what he saw, not a victim, not a mystery, but an act of will. A woman who had ridden into a hard town in a hard season, alone. He had named her courage, not her circumstance. A sound escaped her throat, a choked, rusty noise that she barely recognized. Then it came again, bubbling up from a place deep inside that she thought had long since turned to stone. It was a laugh, a real, genuine, startling laugh. It was rough and out of practice, but it was honest. It felt like cracking open a window in a sealed room, letting in a sudden, shocking rush of fresh air. The absurdity of it, the simple, unadorned truth of his statement, had broken through her armor. Her laughter died as quickly as it had come, leaving a faint smile on her lips and a renewed warmth in her cheeks. She saw a slight softening at the corners of the stranger's mouth. He gave a single, respectful nod, then turned his attention to the blacksmith as if their exchange had been the most natural thing in the world. "Croft," he said, "that bridle I left with you, is the stitching done?" "Nearly, Callahan. Give me an hour," the blacksmith grunted, his eyes darting from the tall cowboy Callahan to Clara, a new, speculative look on his face. Clara looked down at the piece of leather in her hands. Her seam was perfect, straight, tight, and strong. She held it out for the blacksmith to inspect. Mr. Croft took it, running a calloused thumb over her work. He squinted at it, held it up to the light, and even tried to pull the two pieces apart. They held fast. He grunted again, a sound that, this time, held a grudging note of approval. "All right," he said, not looking at her but at the saddle on the stand. "You can start with mending. I'll pay you by the piece. If your work is as good as this stitch, it'll be steady. You can start now." Relief, pure and potent, washed over Clara, so strong it almost made her knees weak. She had a job. She had a purpose. She could stay. She simply nodded, not trusting her voice. "Thank you, Mr. Croft." As she gathered the tools to begin her first real piece of work, she was acutely aware of the man, Beau Callahan, as he spoke in low tones with the blacksmith. When he was done, he walked toward the door, his spurs jingling softly. For a brief second, his eyes met hers again across the fire-lit space. He gave another small, almost imperceptible nod, and then he was gone, leaving only the cold swirl of air from the open door and the lingering echo of a question that had, for the first time in months, made her feel like a person rather than a problem. Mr. Croft was a man of his word. The work was steady, and he paid her fairly, counting out the coins into her palm at the end of each week without ceremony, with her first proper earnings. Clara left the suffocating confines of the boarding house room. She found a place that suited her better, a small, abandoned trapper's cabin on the edge of town, where the main street dissolved back into the open prairie. It stood a short distance from the tanner's yard, and the sharp, earthy smell of curing hides was a constant presence in the air, a scent she was beginning to associate with her own hard-won independence. The cabin was little more than a single room built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone fireplace, a packed earth floor, and a door that hung slightly crooked on its leather hinges. It was a shell, empty of comfort and history, and for that, Clara was grateful. It held no ghosts. She spent 2 days making it habitable, stuffing the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and dried grass to keep out the relentless Wyoming wind. She scrubbed the floor and the soot-stained stones of the hearth, and built a simple cot frame from scavenged wood, stuffing a mattress sack with dry prairie grass that rustled softly whenever she moved. Her life settled into a stark, simple rhythm. Before dawn, she would rise in the cold darkness, light a small fire to boil water for coffee, and eat a piece of dry bread. Then she would walk to the smithy as the sun was casting its first pale, watery light over the plains. All day. She worked at her bench in the corner of the forge. The rhythmic clang of Croft's hammer became the metronome of her days. She breathed in the scents of hot metal, coal smoke, and leather, and they became the smells of survival. She sewed leather like it was her shield. Each push of the awl, each pull of the waxed thread, was a deliberate act of construction. She was not just mending a bridle or reinforcing a saddle seam. She was stitching her own life back together, one small, strong piece at a time. Her hands, which had once been kept soft and useless in Elias Thorne's house, grew tough and calloused. A blister on her palm became a badge of honor. The ache in her shoulders at the end of the day was a satisfying pain, an ache earned through her own labor. The townsfolk who came into the smithy still looked at her, the lone woman working at a man's trade, but their whispers began to change. Curiosity was slowly, grudgingly, being replaced by a measure of respect. Her work was good, it was strong, it was honest, and in a place like Ash Bluff, those qualities carried more weight than a marriage certificate. Her evenings were her own. She would return to her cabin as dusk settled, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple. After a simple meal, she would sit by her small fire, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. This was when the loneliness was most acute. The silence of the cabin was a living thing, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the mournful sigh of the wind. And on clear, cold nights, another sound would join the chorus, the distant, haunting howl of a wolf pack, a lonely cry that seemed to speak directly to the vast, empty space that had opened up inside her. She was not afraid of the sound. She would listen to it, her hands wrapped around a warm cup, and feel a strange sense of kinship. They were survivors, just like her, calling out to the wild, untamed darkness. It was on the third morning after she had moved into the cabin that she found the first gift. As she opened the crooked door to face the dawn, she saw it sitting on the flat stone that served as her stoop. It was a small cloth sack, neatly tied. Puzzled, she picked it up. Inside were dark, fragrant coffee beans, more than she could have afforded in a month. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. She scanned the empty landscape around her cabin, but there was no one. The snow was unmarked, save for her own tracks from the day before. Whoever had left it had come and gone like a ghost. 2 days later, there was another package in the same spot. This time it was a slab of smoked bacon, wrapped in butcher's paper. The next week, a small bag of flour. They appeared without a pattern, silent offerings left in the pre-dawn gloom. She never saw anyone. She never heard a footstep, but she knew, in the marrow of her bones, she knew it was Beau Callahan. She had seen him a few times since their first meeting. He would come into the smithy to have a horseshoe replaced or to pick up the bridle he'd had mended the one she had worked on. He would nod a polite greeting to her, his clear blue eyes meeting hers for only a moment. But in that moment, she felt the same unnerving sense of being truly seen. He never lingered. He conducted his business with Croft and then left. He never mentioned the parcels on her stoop, and his quiet dignity made it impossible for her to ask. To speak of it, she sensed, would be to break the fragile, unspoken understanding that was growing between them. He was not giving her charity. He was offering support in the only way he knew how, a way that demanded nothing in return, not even thanks. It was a silent conversation, carried on through gestures of quiet respect. Her mind, so long accustomed to suspicion, wrestled with his motives. Men did not give things for free. Elias had given her security in exchange for her soul. What did this silent cowboy want? But as the days turned into weeks, and the simple, practical gifts continued to appear, a new, tentative feeling began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. He was not trying to buy her favor. He was not trying to indebt her. He was simply helping. He had seen her struggle, and he was easing her burden in small, unobtrusive ways. He was treating her not as a woman to be courted, but as a fellow traveler on a hard road. Then one morning, the gift was different. It was not a sack of food. It was a book. It was sitting on the stoop, its worn leather cover darkened with age and use. It was a slim volume, with no title on the spine. She picked it up, her calloused fingers tracing the indentations on the cover. It felt warm, as if it still held the heat from someone's hands. She took it inside and sat by the fire, turning it over and over. It was the most personal offering yet. Food was for the body, but a book was for the mind, for the quiet hours after the work was done. It was an acknowledgement of her life beyond the workbench. With a sense of trepidation, she opened it. The pages were yellowed and soft, the corners rounded from countless readings. It was a collection of essays by Mr. Emerson. She read a few lines, the words speaking of self-reliance, of nature, of the strength of the individual spirit. They were ideas that resonated with the new life she was trying to build, sentiments that gave voice to the fierce, fragile independence she clung to. As she turned a page, a small, folded piece of paper fell out onto her lap. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it, the explanation, the demand. Her hand trembled slightly as she unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was just a single sentence, written in a strong, clear hand, the script of a man who was deliberate in his movements. The ink was faded, but the words were plain. Asterisk. Not all men want to take, some just want to understand. Asterisk. Clara stared at the words until they blurred. She read them again, and then a third time. Each word landed like a stone in the still, deep pool of her mistrust, sending ripples out to its very edges. Asterisk. Not all men want to take. The sentence was a direct rebuttal to the entirety of her experience with Elias Thorne, a man whose every action had been a form of taking. He had taken her youth, her name, her sense of self. He had taken what he wanted from her in the dark, without tenderness, without a thought for the person whose body he was using. This simple line of script, left by a man she barely knew, was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in years. It was not a compliment on her appearance or a flowery promise of affection. It was something far more profound. It was an offering of respect for her past, for the unseen wounds she carried. It was a promise not of protection, but of perception. Asterisk. Some just want to understand. He wasn't trying to possess her or save her. He was trying to see her. She closed her eyes, pressing the worn book cover to her chest. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow or self-pity. It was a tear of release, a melting of a shard of ice that had been lodged near her heart for 2 long years. That night, when the wolves began to howl, their voices echoing across the frozen plains, Clara did not feel a kinship with their loneliness. Instead, for the first time, she felt a quiet sense of peace. The cabin did not feel like a fortress against the world anymore. It simply felt like home. She was still alone, but for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel entirely unseen. And in the vast, silent wilderness of Wyoming, that small, flickering flame of understanding felt as warm and as vital as the fire burning in her hearth. In the weeks that followed the arrival of the book, a new kind of silence settled between Clara and Beau Callahan. The small, anonymous offerings on her stoop ceased, as if that final, written message had said everything that needed to be said for now. The conversation had shifted from the language of practical support to something deeper and more patient. When their paths crossed, the quiet nod of acknowledgement they shared was no longer that of 2 strangers, but of 2 people who held a fragile, unspoken secret. Clara found herself thinking of the words in the book, asterisk. Not all men want to take asterisk more often than she cared to admit. The thought was a dangerous seed. It was one thing to accept a sack of coffee from a man who kept his distance. It was another to entertain the notion that his motives were as simple and as honorable as they appeared. Her past with Elias had taught her that a man's silence was often a prelude to a demand. His kindness a currency with which he expected to purchase compliance. She could not, would not, allow herself to be bought again, not even for the price of understanding. And so, she threw herself deeper into her work. The leather became her confessor, the all her weapon against the encroaching softness she felt in her heart. She worked longer hours, taking on extra mending jobs from Croft, driven by a need to prove to herself that she was self-sufficient, that the coffee and bacon and flour had been welcome but unnecessary comforts. She was building her shield, stitch by stitch, making it thicker and stronger, preparing for a blow she couldn't predict. One evening, as the autumn sun bled across the horizon in streaks of fiery orange and deep violet, Clara felt a familiar pull toward the livery stable, the need to see Juniper, to press her face into the mare's warm, dusty neck and breathe in her familiar, honest scent, was a comfort she allowed herself at the end of a long day. It was a visit to the only living creature to whom she felt she owed nothing, and who, in turn, demanded nothing from her but a gentle hand and a measure of oats. The stable was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and the rustle of hay. Most of the day workers had gone, leaving the place in the peaceful gloom of twilight, illuminated by a single lantern hung from a central beam. Its golden light cast long, dancing shadows and made the air thick with the sweet, earthy smells of horse and hay and old wood. She gave Juniper a portion of an apple she'd saved, murmuring softly to the mare as the horse lipped the treat from her palm. It was then, in the quiet periphery of the lantern light, that she saw him. Beau Callahan was in an empty stall near the back, his broad back partially turned to her. He was not tending to a horse. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, a square of clean oilcloth spread on the ground before him. On it, laid out in neat, precise pieces, was his revolver. Clara froze in the shadows, her hand still resting on Juniper's neck. She had seen men with their guns her whole life. She had seen them worn with pride, drawn in anger, fired in celebration, and holstered with grim purpose. But she had never seen this. He was performing a ritual, his large hands moving with a surgeon's care and a lover's familiarity. He worked in silence, using a small, soft rag to wipe down the cylinder, the barrel, the intricate inner workings of the hammer and trigger. Every piece of the deadly machine was given his full, focused attention. It was an act of maintenance, but it felt like something more intimate, a quiet communion between a man and the tool that defined him. A cowboy's gun was an extension of his will, a constant companion that was rarely, if ever, set aside. To be without it was to be vulnerable, to willingly disassemble it in a public space, even one as deserted as the stable, was an act of profound trust in one's surroundings. She watched, unseen. As he finished the cleaning, he oiled each piece with a practiced economy of motion, the metal gleaming in the lantern light. And then he did something that made her breath catch in her throat. Instead of reassembling the weapon, he carefully, deliberately, laid each polished piece back onto the oilcloth. The barrel, the cylinder, the frame, the trigger guard, he arranged them all. A collection of inert metal parts, harmless and disconnected. He laid his gun down, utterly dismantled, on the stable floor. Then he simply sat there for a moment, his hands resting on his knees, looking at the deconstructed weapon as if in contemplation. He must have sensed her presence then. He didn't startle or turn quickly. He simply lifted his head slowly and looked directly toward the stall where she stood half hidden in the shadows. His blue eyes were calm, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He did not move to cover his work. He did not act ashamed or surprised to be seen in this state of symbolic disarmament. He simply held her gaze, waiting, finding herself discovered. Clara felt a hot flush of embarrassment, as if she had been caught spying. She stepped out of the shadows, her posture stiff. I was just checking on my horse," she said, her voice sounding thin and uncertain. Beau gave a slow, single nod. He did not rise. He remained seated on the bucket, a disarmed man, making no move that could be interpreted as a threat. The power dynamic was inverted. He, with all his size and strength, had made himself the vulnerable one. "He's a fine animal," Beau said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the hay-filled quiet of the stable. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken things, the memory of a note in a book, the silent gifts, the weeks of shared glances. Clara felt the need to fill the silence, to retreat to the safety of practicality. "It's an unusual thing," she said, gesturing with her chin toward the pieces of the gun on the ground. "To see a man take his gun apart like that, to just leave it." Beau looked down at the gleaming parts, then back up at her. His gaze was steady and direct, and it held the same quiet understanding she'd seen in his eyes at the forge. "I don't hold a gun in front of a woman who doesn't need protecting," he said, his voice soft but clear. "You're not weak." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. "You're not weak." It was the opposite of everything Elias had ever implied. Elias's protection had been a cage, predicated on the assumption of her inherent fragility. Beau was acknowledging the very core of her being, the strength she had forged in the fires of loneliness and despair. He was not offering to shelter her from the world. He was recognizing her ability to stand in it on her own. Her first instinct was to deflect, to push back against the raw sincerity of his statement. "I don't need anyone to protect me," she answered, the words coming out more sharply than she intended. They were her creed, the shield she had spent months building. He did not flinch. He did not argue. He simply held her gaze, a flicker of something sadness, or maybe just profound empathy in his eyes. "I know," he said softly. The simple affirmation disarmed her more effectively than any argument could have. He knew. He believed her. He was not trying to take her independence from her. He paused, and then he spoke again, the words that would alter the course of her carefully constructed solitude. "But I'll stand by you when you get tired." Clara stared at him, his words echoing in the vast, quiet space of the stable, and in the even vaster, quieter space of her heart. This was not an offer of protection. It was not a promise to fight her battles for her. It was an offer of partnership, of shared endurance. It was a recognition that strength is not infinite, that even the strongest spirit can grow weary. He wasn't offering to carry her. He was offering to walk beside her, to lend his strength when hers was flagging, to be a steadfast presence in the face of the relentless effort of survival. She, who had learned that a man's presence meant erasure, was being offered a presence that promised reinforcement. She, who had learned that a man's strength was a tool of control, was being offered strength as a buttress. She could not find a single word to say in response. She simply stood there, her hand still resting on Juniper's warm, solid flank, and looked at the strong, quiet man who had laid his weapon down, not as a surrender, but as a sign of peace. He had laid his gun down first, and in doing so, he had invited her, finally, to consider laying down her own shield. Beau's words in the stable did not settle peacefully into Clara's mind. They were stones dropped into a still, frozen pond, cracking the surface and troubling the dark water beneath. "I'll stand by you when you get tired." The phrase echoed in the quiet moments of her day when her hands would still over a piece of leather, when she stared into the glowing heart of the forge, when she walked the cold, dusty street back to her cabin. It was a promise that asked for nothing, a declaration of alliance that felt more foreign and more dangerous than any threat. Protection. She understood. It was a cage, a form of ownership. Elias Thorne had protected her prospects by marrying her, and in doing so, had owned her. But what Bo offered was different. It was support without ownership, strength without control. The concept was so alien that her mind, conditioned by years of caution, could not fully accept it. She waited for the other shoe to drop, for the unspoken price to be named, but nothing came. He kept his distance. His greetings were the same quiet nods. His presence in town a steady, unobtrusive fact. His respect was so constant it began to feel more unsettling than any advance would have. It was slowly, methodically, taking apart the wall she had built around her heart, leaving her feeling exposed and raw. The past, which she had kept so successfully at bay through sheer force of will and the exhaustion of hard labor, began to seep through the cracks. A glimpse of a couple walking arm in arm, the man's hand resting gently on the small of the woman's back, would send a cold tremor through her. The low murmur of a man's voice from the saloon at night would make her flinch. Bo's kindness had inadvertently made the memory of Elias's coldness more vivid. The contrast between the two men a stark, painful relief against the canvas of her memory. The breaking point came on a moonless, starless night, when the wind howled around the corners of her small cabin like a hungry animal. She had gone to bed exhausted, but sleep did not offer its usual dreamless refuge. Instead, it dragged her back to a place she had never allowed her waking mind to revisit. She was in a large, cold room, the air thick with the unfamiliar scent of lavender and beeswax. She was wearing a borrowed nightgown of fine, smooth linen that felt like a shroud against her skin. Moonlight, as pale and cold as bone, filtered through a tall window, painting a sterile silver rectangle on the polished floorboards. She was waiting, a bride on her wedding night, waiting for a man whose face she could barely recall from the brief, formal ceremony. The dream memory was unnervingly clear, yet devoid of emotion. It was like watching a scene unfold from a great, hollow distance. The door opened without a sound, and a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the hallway. Elias. He was just a silhouette, a shape of a man, featureless and imposing. He did not speak. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered all thought. He came to the bed, and she felt the dip in the mattress as his weight settled beside her. There was no touch, no kiss, no word of reassurance. There was only the rustle of fabric and the cold draft of air as he turned to her. The act itself was a silent, methodical transaction. It was a claiming, not a joining. She felt a sense of profound detachment, as if her spirit had floated up to the ceiling to watch the dispassionate claiming of a piece of property. The most terrifying part of the dream was not the physical act, but the crushing, absolute meaninglessness of it. It was a duty performed, a contract sealed. Her body was a vessel, her presence an afterthought. Asterisk. Her first night had no meaning. It was not the beginning of a life together, but the beginning of her erasure. When it was over, he rolled away, his back a formidable, unforgiving wall. Soon, the sound of his steady, even breathing filled the oppressive silence. He was asleep, and she was left to lie awake in the chilling aftermath, feeling a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was the cold of utter solitude, the chilling realization that she was more alone now, in this bed with her husband, than she had ever been in her life. Clara awoke with a strangled gasp, bolting upright on her straw-filled cot. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. A cold sweat slicked her skin, and the thin wool blanket felt as heavy and suffocating as a layer of damp earth. The dream clung to her, its chilling residue filling the dark corners of her cabin. The wind howled outside, mimicking the scream that was trapped in her throat. She wrapped her arms around her knees, trying to make herself smaller, trying to fend off the phantom cold that radiated from the core of her being. The cabin, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like the same cold, silent room from her memory. She was trapped, alone with the ghosts. It was in that moment of raw, unreasoning panic that she heard it. A sound, so soft, she at first thought it was the wind, or a branch scraping against the roof. It came again, a gentle, rhythmic tapping, asterisk tap, tap, tap. Not on the door, on the rough log wall beside the window. Fear, sharp and primal, shot through her. A visitor, in the dead of night, at her isolated cabin. Her mind raced. A drunk from the saloon, a drifter, she slid from the cot, her bare feet silent on the cold earth floor, and crept toward the single, small window. Her hands trembled as she pulled the edge of the burlap curtain aside just enough to see. A figure was sitting on the stone stoop, his back resting against the cabin wall, the source of the sound. He was a dark shape against the lesser dark of the night, his hat pulled low, his shoulders slumped slightly, as if in weariness. He wasn't trying the door. He wasn't peering in the window. He was just sitting there, waiting, keeping vigil. It was Bo. How could he know? Had she cried out in her sleep? Had some sound of her distress carried on the wind? The questions faded, replaced by the stark reality of his presence. He was here. He was keeping his promise. He was standing by. For a long moment, she just watched him, her heart still pounding, but for a different reason now. The fear was receding, replaced by a terrifying, overwhelming wave of something else. Trust. It was the most vulnerable feeling of all. To stay inside, behind her locked door, was to stay safe with the ghosts she knew. To open it was to step into an unknown country, to face a man who saw the cracks in her shield. Her body moved before her mind had fully consented. Her hand, of its own accord, lifted the heavy wooden bar from the door. The sound of it sliding free was deafeningly loud in the small space. She pulled the crooked door inward, and a blast of cold, damp air swirled around her, making her shiver. Bo looked up. He didn't seem surprised, just patient, in the faint, ambient light of the starless sky. She could see his face, his expression etched with a deep, quiet concern. He didn't speak. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just waited, giving her the space to own the moment. She stood there in the doorway, clutching the thin blanket around her shoulders, feeling fragile and utterly exposed. The truth of her nightmare, the secret shame she had carried for so long, rose up and spilled out of her in a raw, broken whisper. My first night meant nothing. The confession hung in the cold air between them, a wisp of vapor carrying the weight of her entire past. It was the deepest source of her pain, the moment her spirit had been taught it was worthless. Bo's gaze never wavered. He didn't flinch. He didn't fill the silence with easy platitudes or words of pity. He simply looked at her, his blue eyes seeming to absorb all her pain, all her shame, and hold it without judgment. And then he gave a single, slow nod. That simple gesture of acceptance was more healing than 1,000 words of comfort could ever be. It said, "Asterisk, I hear you. I believe you. Your pain is real." He was not trying to fix it. He was bearing witness to it. A long moment passed, the only sound the mournful cry of the wind. Clara felt a great, shuddering breath leave her body, a release of tension she had held for years. Bo finally stirred, shifting his position as if to rise. He looked from her haunted face toward the eastern horizon, which was still cloaked in an impenetrable darkness. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, but it held a promise as solid and as real as the waking earth. "Then I will give you all the morning." The words settled over her, not erasing the darkness of the night, but promising the certainty of the dawn. He wasn't offering to slay her dragons or vanquish her ghosts. He was offering her the future. He was offering her light, a new day, and then another, and another after that. All of them untainted by the shadows of the past. All of them hers to claim. She said nothing, could say nothing. She just stood in the doorway of her small, lonely cabin, the cold wind on her face, and watched as he finally rose to his feet. He gave her one last, long look, a look that promised steadfastness, and then he turned and walked away, his tall form disappearing into the lingering dark. Clara remained in the doorway long after he was gone, feeling the chill on her skin, but a strange, new warmth spreading from her core. The wind no longer sounded like a threat. The darkness no longer felt like a cage. She stood there and waited, her gaze fixed on the eastern sky, until the first faint, gray promise of the dawn appeared on the horizon. It was the beginning of her first morning. The morning after Beau's vigil at her cabin, the world felt fundamentally altered. The light was sharper, the air cleaner. When Clara walked to the smithy, the stares of the townspeople seemed to slide off her, no longer able to penetrate the fragile, new sense of peace that had settled in her soul. His promise asterisk, "I will give you all the mornings" asterisk, was not a declaration of love, but something far more valuable, a declaration of presence. He had not tried to kiss her, to hold her, to storm the gates of her fortress. He had simply waited outside until she was ready to open the door herself. Their interactions found a new, quiet rhythm. A few days later, Beau approached her at the forge, his hat held respectfully in his hands. "Clara," he said, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it in his low voice was both startling and strangely right. "The tack at my place. My father wasn't one for mending. It's falling apart. I'd be obliged if you'd take a look. I can pay you for your time." It was an invitation disguised as a business proposition, an offering of entry into his world that she could accept without compromising her independence. "I can do that," she said simply, and the matter was settled. The following Sunday, he arrived at her cabin with a gentle-eyed sorrel mare saddled for her. They rode out of town together, heading north toward the low, rolling hills where the Callahan Ranch lay. They rode mostly in silence, but it was no longer a silence of caution or uncertainty. It was a comfortable quiet, filled with the soft creak of saddle leather, the rhythmic plod of hooves, and the vast, sighing expanse of the Wyoming sky. The Callahan Ranch was not a grand operation, but a modest, hard-worked spread nestled in a shallow valley carved by a winding creek. A simple, sturdy ranch house stood beside a large barn and a series of corrals, all of it showing the signs of age and neglect. It was the legacy of a man, Beau's father, who had clearly been more concerned with his cattle than with paint or polish. To Clara, it looked like a place of honest, unending work. It looked like a home. Beau's request had been an understatement. The tack room was a graveyard of leather. Bridles were cracked, reins were frayed, and saddles sat listing on their stands with broken stitching and worn-out fleece. For Clara, it was a welcome challenge. She chose a corner of the barn, swept it clean, and set up a makeshift workshop. Beau provided her with a sturdy bench and any tools she required from his father's old collection. And so they began to work. Their days fell into a pattern built around shared labor. While she meticulously disassembled a saddle, cleaning and oiling the dry, thirsty leather and replacing worn pieces, he would be outside, mending a fence line or tending to the cattle. They would often eat their midday meal together, sitting on an overturned wagon tongue, sharing bread and jerky and speaking little. Their quiet companionship a more potent conversation than words could ever be. It was in the round corral, however, that the true nature of their partnership was forged. Beau was working with a young, half-wild Mustang, a beautiful buckskin with a fearful eye and a spirit that refused to be broken by force. Clara would often pause in her work, drawn to the silent, patient drama unfolding in the dust of the pen. Beau's method was one of quiet patience. He never used force, never a harsh word. He moved slowly, deliberately, speaking to the horse in a low, calm murmur, teaching it to yield to pressure not from fear, but from trust. One afternoon, he saw her watching from the fence. "He's a stubborn one," Beau said, stroking the Mustang's neck as the horse trembled but held its ground. "He's known a hard hand before. He's got to learn that not all hands are the same." The words hung in the air, a clear echo of the note he had left in the book. "Come on in," he said, his voice a gentle invitation. "Just stand. Let him get used to you." Hesitantly, Clara slipped between the rails. She stood near the fence, her hands clasped behind her back, trying to make herself small and non-threatening. The Mustang's ears swiveled, its dark eyes fixing on her, nostrils flaring. "Just breathe." "Clara," Bo murmured, not looking at her but at the horse. "Let him feel that you ain't a threat." She did as he said, letting out a long, slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Day after day, this became part of their routine. She would stand in the corral while he worked, her calm presence becoming a part of the landscape of trust he was building with the animal. Soon, he was asking her to hold the lead rope, then to stroke the horse's long face. The animal, sensing her own quiet, wounded stillness, began to accept her. There was no leader and no follower in that pen. Bo had the knowledge of the horse, but she had an intuitive empathy for its fear. They worked together, a silent, seamless team, gentling the wild creature between them. The town, of course, began to talk. Clara's long absences from her cabin were noted. Her rides out to the Callahan Ranch with Bo became the primary subject of gossip at the general store. The whispers followed her whenever she had to go into town for supplies. Mrs. Gable, her former landlady, looked at her with undisguised disapproval. The women saw a woman living on a bachelor's ranch without the sanction of marriage. They saw shame. But a profound change had taken place within Clara. Their words, which once would have felt like stones thrown at her, now felt like feathers tossed on the wind. She heard them, but she no longer felt their impact. Her worth was not being decided in the court of public opinion. It was being forged every day in the heat of the smithy, in the meticulous strength of her stitches, and in the quiet, steady respect she saw in Bo Callahan's eyes. She was no longer the husbandless widow or the strange woman who came in the snow. She was Clara Wynne, a woman who earned her keep and stood on her own 2 feet, and she was the partner of a good, quiet man. She did not care what they called it. Their peaceful world, built on the foundations of shared work and unspoken understanding, was shattered on a Tuesday. Clara had ridden into town to pick up a special order of silver conchos for a saddle she was restoring. As she was leaving the general store, a polished, handsome carriage, pulled by 2 matching bays, rattled to a stop in front of the land office. It was a vehicle of Eastern elegance, utterly out of place in the dusty, pragmatic landscape of Ash Bluff. The driver, a man in a crisp suit, jumped down to open the door. The woman who emerged was the physical opposite of Clara in every conceivable way. She was petite and exquisitely dressed in a traveling gown of deep blue silk, with a feathered hat perched atop a cascade of perfectly coiffed blonde curls. She moved with a practiced, fluid grace, a woman entirely comfortable with being the center of attention. As she turned, her gaze swept the street, and Clara felt a sickening jolt of recognition. It was the laugh. Though she couldn't hear it from this distance, she remembered its tinkling, musical quality from Elias Thorne's parlor. It was his cousin, the woman who had taken her place, the woman Bo had just called Delilah. Clara stood frozen, her package of conchos clutched in her hand. Delilah's eyes scanned the town, and then, as if drawn by a magnet, they found Bo, who was just coming out of the smithy, wiping his hands on a rag. A brilliant, radiant smile transformed Delilah's face. "Bo!" she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the street, a silken ribbon of sound. She glided toward him, her hands outstretched. "Bo Callahan, I'd heard you'd come back to this dusty little corner of the world." She placed her gloved hands on his arms, a gesture of familiar, casual intimacy that made Clara's stomach clench. Bo stood stiffly, his expression hardening into a mask of grim disbelief. "Delilah," he said, his voice flat and cold. "What are you doing here?" "Why, I'm here on business." "Of course," she said, tilting her head. She was looking up at him, forcing him to look down at her. A classic feminine wile. "Your dear father's passing. I was so sorry to hear it. But it does create certain legal questions about the land, doesn't it? An old promise is still a promise, after all." From her vantage point, Clara could see it all. She saw the way Delilah's delicate beauty seemed to make Beau's ruggedness more pronounced. She saw the history between them in the way Delilah touched his arm, a casual claim of ownership. And in that moment, the old, terrible wound began to ache again. But this time it was different. With Elias, she had been made to feel invisible. Now, standing here in the dusty street, being measured against this vision of perfect, polished femininity, she was all too visible, and she felt plain. She felt weathered. She felt like the sturdy, practical workhorse next to the sleek, prize-winning mare. She saw the exact moment Delilah noticed her. The woman's gaze flicked past Beau's shoulder and landed on Clara. A slow, knowing smirk touched her perfect lips. Her eyes traveled down Clara's dusty, work-worn dress and then back up to her face. A silent, contemptuous dismissal. Clara turned and walked away, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She untied Juniper's reins with numb fingers and mounted, not looking back, the partnership she had built with Beau. A relationship of equals based on skill and strength, suddenly felt fragile. Delilah had brought a different currency to town, the currency of beauty, charm, and a shared past. It was a competition Clara didn't know how to win, a battle she had already lost once before. The mornings Beau had promised her suddenly seemed very far away, shrouded in the long, cold shadow of another woman. Clara rode back to the Callahan ranch with the image of Delilah seared into her mind. The woman was a living ghost from a life Clara had fought to escape, a reminder of a world where a woman's value was measured in silks and social graces, not in the strength of her hands or the resilience of her spirit. The quiet peace she had cultivated with Beau, a peace built on the solid ground of mutual respect and shared labor, now felt as if it were built on shifting sand. She did not speak of what she had seen when Beau returned to the ranch that evening, his face a grim, stony mask. But he spoke of it. He found her by the creek, skipping smooth, flat stones across the water's darkening surface. "You saw her," he stated, not a question. Clara nodded, not looking at him. "She is like him?" she said softly. The name Elias Thorne a bitter taste she refused to speak. "She was my brother's wife," Beau said, his voice low and heavy with a history Clara couldn't know. "Caleb was a good man, but he was bewitched by her. She came from the East, full of talk of society and big plans. My father, he saw the poison in her from the start. He saw that she loved the idea of a land inheritance more than she ever loved his son. After Caleb died of a fever, she and my father had a falling out. She claimed he'd promised the land to Caleb, and therefore to her. He claimed he'd promised it to his bloodline. She left for the East, swearing she'd be back one day with a lawyer to take what was hers." He paused, kicking at a loose stone. "I never thought she'd make good on the threat." His explanation eased one fear she was not a past lover, but planted a new, more dangerous one. This was not about affection. This was about property, legacy, and law. It was a fight Clara had no place in, a battle over a history that was not her own. Delilah did not wage her war with cannons and rifles. Her weapons were far more insidious: a tilted head, a concerned whisper, a cup of tea in the right woman's parlor. She took a room at the boarding house, and within 2 days, she had become the central topic of conversation in Ash Bluff. She was a tragic, beautiful widow, a woman of refinement forced to travel to this rough-and-tumble town to claim her rightful inheritance from a difficult family. Her primary target, however, was not Beau. It was Clara. Delilah began her campaign in the sewing circle hosted by Mrs. Gable, the boarding house owner and the undisputed queen of town gossip, with practiced sorrow in her eyes. Delilah would speak of her concern for Beau. "He has such a good heart," she would sigh, taking a delicate sip of tea. He always did, but he's been alone for so long. He's vulnerable. And this woman, the one working at the smithy, she would pause, letting the other women lean in. I ask around, and no one seems to know where she came from. A Mrs. Wynne, she calls herself, but there is no Mr. Wynne to be found, and now she's living out at the Callahan Ranch, alone, with him. She let the implication hang in the air, thick and poisonous. It's just not proper, she'd continue, her voice laced with honeyed venom. A woman of no standing, no family to speak for her, living with a man out of wedlock. It brings a certain reputation to a town. I worry for him, and for the moral character of Ash Bluff. The poison spread with the speed of a prairie fire. What began as whispers in a sewing circle became open speculation at the general store, then hardened into cold, hard judgment in the town square. Clara felt the change immediately. The next time she rode into town for supplies, the atmosphere was palpably different. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper who had always greeted her with a polite nod, suddenly found himself intensely busy counting the cans on a high shelf, leaving his young son to serve her with averted eyes. The whispers were the worst part. They were like biting flies, always at the edge of her hearing. She would see two women talking by the well. As she approached, their conversation would cease, and they would turn their backs. A silent, damning indictment. The few ranchers who had once brought their tack directly to her, praising her strong stitch, now went through Croft, their faces impassive and distant. She was no longer Clara, the skilled leatherworker. She was Callahan's woman, a phrase spat out with a mixture of contempt and salacious curiosity. The final, devastating blow came a week after Delilah's arrival. Clara walked into the smithy, the one place she had felt truly anchored, to find Mr. Croft standing by his cold anvil, his leather apron off, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He would not meet her eyes. "Clara," he began, his voice a low, uncomfortable rumble. We need to talk." A cold dread pooled in Clara's stomach. "What is it, Mr. Croft?" He finally looked at her, his expression a mixture of pity and grim resolve. "My wife, she's a good woman. She goes to the church. She listens to the talk. And the talk is all about you and Callahan." He took a deep breath. "Folks are saying you're living out there in sin, that you're a woman of ill repute. Now, I've never had cause to complain about your work. It's the best I've seen. But I can't have my smithy, a decent family establishment, associated with that kind of scandal. It's bad for business. It's bad for my family's name." Every word was a hammer blow, not to hot iron, but to her very soul. This place, this work, had been her salvation. It was the proof of her worth, the foundation of her independence. And it was being taken from her because of whispers, because of a lie spun by a woman in a silk dress. "Mr. Croft, it's not—" she began, but the words died in her throat. How could she explain? How could she describe the quiet, respectful partnership she had with Beau to a man whose world was defined by the rigid lines of propriety? "I'm sorry, Clara," he said, and she believed he truly was. "But I have to let you go. I can pay you for the work you finished, but I can't give you any more." She stood there for a long moment, the heat of the forge no longer warming her, the familiar sounds of the smithy replaced by a ringing silence in her ears. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. She could not trust herself to speak. She gathered her personal tools from the workbench, her favorite awl, the skiving knife she had sharpened to a razor's edge, and wrapped them in a piece of oilcloth. Then she walked out of the smithy, leaving her independence behind her on the dusty floor. She rode back to the ranch in a daze, the world a blur of muted colors. The whispers had finally solidified into a wall, and she had just walked straight into it. Beau was in the corral, working with the buckskin Mustang, which now followed him with a trusting eye. He saw her approach, and the smile on his face faded as he took in her expression. He left the horse and met her at the fence, his gaze searching hers. "Clara, what's wrong?" She slid from the saddle, her legs unsteady. "Croft fired me," she said, her voice flat and devoid of all emotion. He said he couldn't have a woman like me working for him, a woman living in sin." She watched the change come over Beau's face, the quiet patience, the gentle calm she had come to know, vanished as if it had never existed. It was replaced by something cold and terrifying. A glacial fury settled in his blue eyes, turning them to chips of ice. His jaw tightened, and a muscle jumped in his cheek. He said nothing. He simply turned and started walking toward the ranch house. Clara knew where he was going. His gun belt was hanging on a peg just inside the door. He was going to settle this the way men on the frontier settled things. He was going to face down the whispers with the cold, hard finality of a drawn gun. He would confront Croft, or maybe even go looking for the source of the poison herself. She ran after him, catching him just as he reached the porch. She grabbed his arm. It was like grabbing a block of granite. "Beau, no," she said, her voice urgent. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the town, a distant smudge on the horizon. "She has no right to do this to you," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "And you have no right to make it worse," she retorted, her own fear giving way to a fierce, protective anger for him, for what they had built. She moved to stand in front of him, blocking his path, and put her hands on his chest. It was the first time she had ever willingly initiated such intimate contact. "Don't you see this is what she wants? She wants you to be the brute, the lawless cowboy who solves his problems with a gun. If you go into that town with anger in your heart and that colt on your hip, you will prove every single word she has said about us is true. You will make me the harlot you're fighting over." He finally looked down at her, the storm still raging in his eyes. "Then what am I supposed to do? Let them tear you down. Let them take away the one thing you've built for yourself." "No," Clara said, her voice dropping, becoming steady and strong. Her hands were still on his chest, and she could feel the furious pounding of his heart beneath her palms. Don't let him. This isn't a fight you can win with a bullet. Beau, a bullet can't kill a rumor. It only makes it bleed into a legend. You laid your gun down for me once. You have to lay it down again." He stared at her, his breathing heavy, the internal battle visible on his face. She did not look away. She held his gaze, her own gray eyes as unyielding as his. She was not the woman who had ridden into Ash Bluff broken and afraid. She was not the woman who cowered from whispers. She was his partner, and she would not let him destroy them both to save her pride. Slowly, agonizingly, she felt the tension begin to drain out of him. The granite of his arm softened. The fury in his eyes receded, replaced by a dawning, grudging understanding. He had offered to stand by her when she was tired. Now she was standing in front of him, holding him back from the brink, proving that sometimes the one who needs saving is the one holding the gun. The days following Clara's intervention were a quiet, taut prelude to a storm. Delilah, having failed to incite Beau to violence, retreated and deployed her more civilized weapons. A man arrived on the afternoon stagecoach, a lawyer from Cheyenne with a slick leather briefcase and an even slicker smile. Within a day, a formal notice was delivered to the ranch. Delilah was suing for title to the Callahan property, citing a verbal inheritance promised to her late husband, Caleb, by his father. A preliminary hearing was set for the end of the week, to be held in the town hall and presided over by Judge Miller, a circuit judge who was more accustomed to settling disputes over stolen cattle than untangling family legacies. The news ripped through Ash Bluff, providing a fresh, potent source of gossip. The town was now officially a theater, and everyone had a front row seat. The prevailing sentiment, carefully cultivated by Delilah's parlor room diplomacy, favored the beautiful, tragic widow over the brooding, silent cowboy and his scandalous companion. Beau retreated into a fortress of quiet fury. The fight had moved onto unfamiliar ground. a battlefield of papers and legal jargon where his strength and integrity counted for nothing. He was a man of action, of fences to be mended and cattle to be driven. This new conflict required a different kind of endurance, a patience for deception and manipulation that he did not possess. He spent his days working with a grim, relentless energy, as if he could physically exhaust the helplessness that was eating away at him. At night, he would sit by the fire, staring into the flames, his hands clenching and unclenching, a caged bear pacing the confines of his own frustration. While Beau brooded, Clara acted, having been stripped of her work, her reputation, and her small place in the town. She found she had nothing left to lose and, therefore, everything to fight for. She saw the despair in Beau's eyes, the slow poison of injustice seeping into his soul, and a fierce, protective instinct rose up in her, stronger than any fear she had ever known. He had stood by her when she was tired. Now it was her turn. His father's house was their only hope. It was a place of masculine neglect, filled with the accumulated history of a man who had never thrown anything away. While Beau was out riding the fence lines, Clara began her own quiet, methodical campaign. She started in the small, dusty office where old man Callahan had conducted his business. It was a chaotic mess of receipts, bills of sale for cattle, and almanacs from years past. She spent 2 days sorting through the clutter, her hands becoming coated in a fine layer of dust and history. She was not sure what she was looking for. A will, perhaps, or a deed. But as she worked, a picture of Beau's father began to emerge. He was a man of meticulous detail. In a large, leather-bound ledger, he had recorded every transaction, every head of cattle bought or sold, every tax payment on the land, stretching back 20 years. She saw the entries for the years Caleb and Delilah had been married. There was no indication of shared ownership, only payments made from the elder Callahan's account. Her first discovery was tucked inside the ledger, a hand-drawn survey map of the ranch, its boundaries clearly marked, with a note at the bottom in a spidery hand, "For my boy, Beau." Who knows the feel of this dirt? It was signed and dated, but not notarized. It was a statement of intent, not a legal document. Still, she folded it carefully and set it aside. The real treasure was in a heavy wooden trunk at the back of a storage closet, a place that likely hadn't been opened in a decade. It was filled not with legal papers, but with personal effects, a cavalry medal, a pair of worn-out spurs, and at the very bottom, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were letters from Beau's father, written to his brother in Missouri. Clara sat on the floor, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light from the doorway, and began to read. The letters were a chronicle of a father's hopes and frustrations. He wrote of the weather, the price of beef, and his sons, and he wrote of Delilah. Asterisk Caleb has brought home a woman from the east. Asterisk one letter read, asterisk. She is as pretty as a porcelain doll, and just as fragile and useless in this country. She speaks of turning this ranch into a grand estate, but she has never mucked a stall or pulled a calf. She has eyes for the land, not for the life it requires. I fear for my boy. She will break his heart, or his bank account, or both. Asterisk. Another letter, written a year later, after Caleb's death, was even more damning. Asterisk. The doll wife speaks of promises I never made. She claims I told Caleb the land would be his. I told him a man's legacy is what he builds, not what he is given. She does not understand this. She thinks land is a thing you possess, like a string of pearls. Beau is the one who understands. He has the heart of this place in him. It is for him. It will always be for him. I will see her in perdition before I let her turn his birthright into a plaything. Asterisk. Clara's hands trembled as she held the brittle paper. This was it. This was the truth, written in the old man's own hand. It was the voice of the land itself, speaking from beyond the grave. On the day of the hearing, the town hall was filled to bursting. It was a stifling, airless room that smelled of sawdust and sweat and anticipation. Every bench was packed. Delilah sat at the front beside her lawyer, the picture of aggrieved widowhood in a modest but elegant black dress. She looked pale and sorrowful, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Beau sat at the opposing table, alone. He looked like a mountain that had been forced indoors, his broad shoulders seeming too wide for the flimsy chair, his calloused hands resting awkwardly on the polished wood. He looked uncomfortable, cornered, and utterly out of his depth. Judge Miller called the room to order, and Delilah's lawyer began. He spoke with a smooth, practiced eloquence, painting a picture of his client's tragic loss and Beau's callous refusal to honor his father's dying wish. He referred to Beau as a man of unstable temperament and alluded to the unseemly and scandalous arrangement at the Callahan Ranch. Using Clara's reputation as another weapon to discredit Beau's character, the townspeople murmured their assent, their faces a gallery of pious judgment. Just as the lawyer was reaching the crescendo of his argument, the doors at the back of the hall swung open. A collective gasp went through the room. Clara Wynne stood in the doorway. All eyes turned to her. The whispers started instantly. A hostile, sibilant wave. She was the scandal, the fallen woman, walking into the heart of her own disgrace. But the woman who stood there was not the woman who had flinched from their stares weeks ago. Her dress was plain and mended, but it was clean. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, and her spine was as straight as a gun barrel. Her gray eyes, clear and cold as a winter river, swept across the room, meeting the hostile gazes without a flicker of fear. In her hand, she carried a worn leather satchel. She ignored the whispers. She ignored the pointing fingers. She walked down the central aisle, the sound of her worn boots on the wooden floor, the only sound in the suddenly silent room. She walked directly to the front and stood beside Beau. He looked up at her, his face a mask of stunned disbelief and dawning, desperate hope. "And who might you be?" Madam the judge asked, peering over his spectacles. "Objection," Delilah's lawyer said smoothly, rising to his feet. "Your Honor, this is Miss Clara Wynne. She has no legal standing in this matter. She is merely an employee of Mr. Callahan's, whose presence here is irrelevant and inflammatory." Clara looked not at the lawyer, but at the judge. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was so clear and steady that it carried to the furthest corner of the room. "My name is Clara Wynne, and I am not irrelevant." She opened her satchel and laid its contents on the table, the ledger, the map, the bundle of letters. She explained what each one was, her voice calm and factual. She read the damning passages from the letters aloud, the old man's gruff, honest words filling the stuffy room with an undeniable truth. A wave of murmuring rippled through the crowd as the tide of opinion began, grudgingly, to turn. Delilah's face had gone from pale to ashen, her mask of sorrow replaced by a tight, thin line of fury. Her lawyer sputtered objections, but the judge waved him to silence, his interest clearly piqued. When she was finished, Clara stacked the papers neatly. She turned, not to the judge, but to the town. Her gaze moved over the faces of the people who had judged her, who had cost her her job, who had whispered her name like a curse. She stood taller than any lawman, taller than any judge, because her authority came not from a badge, but from a truth she had fought for. "You people look at me and you whisper," she said, her voice ringing with a power they had never heard. "You call me a scandal." Her chin lifted. "If I am to be the scandal of this town, then let me be perfectly clear." Her eyes found Delilah's. "I am the one keeping your man from being buried by grief and deceit." Then her gaze swept the room again, including everyone. "And I have taken nothing from anyone. I am only holding fast to what is just." The final words fell into a profound, stunned silence. Clara had not defended her reputation. She had rendered it irrelevant. In that moment, she was not a woman defined by her marital status or by the whispers of gossips. She was a force of will, a woman of substance and strength, who had walked into the fire of public opinion and refused to be burned. The silence that followed Clara's declaration was absolute. It was a vacuum, drawing all the air and noise from the stuffy town hall, leaving only the sight of her standing tall and defiant beside a stunned Beau Callahan. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, but the gazes were no longer uniform. The smug judgment had been shattered, replaced by a complex mixture of shock, confusion, and for the first time, a glimmer of grudging respect. She had held a mirror up to them, and they did not like the reflection. Judge Miller cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. He peered at Delilah over his spectacles, his expression now cold and shrewd. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice laced with judicial frost. "These letters, written in the hand of a man I knew personally for 20 years, seem to speak quite plainly to his intentions. Do you have any notarized document, any witnessed paper, to refute them?" Delilah's face was a mask of incandescent fury. The beautiful, sorrowful widow had vanished, leaving behind a woman of sharp, brittle anger. "He promised my husband," she hissed, her voice losing its silken edge. "He was a senile old man who resented my breeding. He was a man who documented every dollar he ever spent and every acre he ever owned." The judge countered, tapping the ledger Clara had provided. "And there is not one word in 20 years of records to support your claim. This hearing is concluded. The claim is dismissed. The Callahan land belongs to Beau Callahan. Free and clear." He banged his gavel once, the sharp crack sealing Delilah's defeat. The spell was broken. The room erupted in a low murmur as people began to stir, their eyes darting between Delilah, Beau, and the woman who had single-handedly changed the course of the day. Delilah rose to her feet, her movements stiff and jerky. She shot a look of pure venom at Clara, a look that promised a different kind of retribution if looks could kill. Then, without a word, she swept from the room, her elegant facade finally and irrevocably cracked. Her lawyer, looking like a man who had just been handed a fistful of snakes, gathered his papers and scurried after her. The townspeople began to file out, their conversations now hushed and awkward. Some of them glanced at Clara, their expressions sheepish. Mr. Croft, the blacksmith, caught her eye for a brief moment, a look of profound, regretful respect on his face before he looked down at his feet and shuffled out the door. The victory was absolute. The truth had won. But Clara felt no triumph as the room emptied, leaving only her and Beau in the sudden, echoing quiet. A wave of exhaustion so profound it was dizzying washed over her. She had won the battle, but the war had left its scars. She had come to Ash Bluff seeking anonymity, a quiet place to heal and rebuild. Instead, she had become a spectacle. She was no longer Clara Wynne, the skilled leather worker. She was now a legend, the scandal who stood up to the town, the woman who saved Beau Callahan's ranch. Her name would be on everyone's lips for months, the story told and retold, embellished and altered with each telling. She had escaped one cage only to find herself in another, this one built of notoriety. Beau reached out and gently touched her arm. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "You." She pulled away slightly, not from him, but from the weight of the moment. "I should go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to go back." She turned and left before he could say another word. Walking back through the now empty streets to the ranch, the sun felt too bright, the air too thin. The victory felt hollow, a prize she had never wanted. For the rest of the day, a heavy silence lay over the ranch. Beau seemed to understand her need for solitude, leaving her to her thoughts as he went about his chores with a quiet, restless energy. Clara went to her small workshop in the barn, but she couldn't bring herself to touch the leather. Her hands, which had been her salvation, felt useless. She looked around at the life she had started to build here, the smell of the hay, the warmth of the horses, the quiet companionship of the man in the corral, and felt a deep, piercing sorrow. She couldn't stay. To stay would be to live forever in the shadow of this day, to be forever defined by their fight. The partnership they had forged in quiet and solitude would not survive the bright, harsh glare of public fascination. By the time dusk began to settle, her decision was made. It was a hard, cold thing, but it felt necessary. She went to the small room in the ranch house that Bo had given her and began to pack her few belongings into her satchel. The worn book of Emerson's essays, her mending kit, the extra dress she had sewn. Each item felt like a lead weight in her hands. This was what she did. She moved on. It was the only way she knew to stay free. With her satchel packed and her coat on, she walked toward the livery stable to saddle Juniper. Her heart was a cold, tight knot in her chest. She would ride out now, under the cover of darkness. She would leave a note for Bo, thanking him. It was a coward's way, but it was the only way she could bear to do it. But he was there. He was waiting for her, standing just outside the wide stable doors, his tall silhouette framed against the last, deep purple light of the evening. His gun was at his hip, a familiar part of him, but his hat was held in his hands, a gesture of profound respect that made her heart ache. He wasn't blocking her path. He was simply waiting on it. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. She stopped a few feet from him, clutching the handle of her satchel. "I have to, Bo. I can't be a story. I can't be a name people whisper about. I came here for quiet." "You came here for peace," he corrected her gently. "And you fought for it today, for my peace and for yours." "And now everyone will watch us, waiting to see what happens next," she said, a note of desperation in her voice. "They'll pick us apart. They'll ruin the quiet, the thing we built." He took a step closer, his face etched with lines of weariness and a fierce, unwavering sincerity. He looked at her, and his gaze held all the understanding she had come to rely on, all the respect he had shown her from the very first day. He did not say, "I love you." The words would have been too small, too conventional for the vast, untamed thing that had grown between them. Instead, he spoke the truth of his heart, the words sounding as if they had been carved from the deepest part of him. "People ask me," he began, his voice low and rough, "what you are to me? In town today, before, they want a label for you." He shook his head slightly. "I tell them." He looked away for a second, toward the darkening plains, as if gathering the courage to say the words aloud. Then his eyes, clear and true, met hers again. "I tell them you're the one who holds my heart when I have nothing left to hold." The words landed not in her ears, but in the very center of her soul. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. He didn't define her by her relationship to him, his woman, his wife, his lover. He defined her by the essential, life-giving role she played in his spirit. She was the keeper of his core. Before she could react, before she could even breathe, he closed the small distance between them. He gently took her free hand, the one not clutching the satchel, and placed it flat against his chest, over his heart, beneath her palm. She could feel its strong, steady, thumping rhythm. It was a beat of undeniable life, of profound truth. This was not a claiming. It was an offering. He was making himself vulnerable, giving her the very pulse of his life to hold. "I don't have much." "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze locked with hers. "This land, it's just dirt and work. It's not a grand estate. I'm not a man of fancy words or promises." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I have nothing to give, but my name, if you want it." His name, Callahan, a name of strength and quiet integrity, a name that would be a shield, a name that would silence the whispers not by ignoring them, but by answering them with a simple, irrefutable truth. It was not a proposal of ownership. It was the final, missing piece of their partnership. a public declaration of the private alliance they had already forged. To accept it would not be to surrender her independence, but to anchor it to his. She looked into his eyes, and she saw all of her future mornings reflected there. She saw a lifetime of quiet work, of shared burdens, of standing together against whatever storms might come. She saw a home. Her grip on the satchel loosened, and it fell to the dusty ground with a soft thud. The last of her defenses, the instinct to run, had fallen with it. "I want it," she whispered, the words a quiet vow in the twilight. The world seemed to hold its breath in the wake of her whispered word. I want it. 3 small words that unmade a lifetime of caution and rebuilt a future on the foundation of a single, trust-filled moment. Beau did not smile, not in the conventional sense. Instead, a profound gentleness softened the rugged lines of his face, a deep and abiding peace settling into his clear blue eyes. He reached down and picked up her fallen satchel, its weight now insignificant, a relic from a journey that had just found its destination. He didn't lead her back to the main ranch house, the place that held the ghosts of his father and the lingering shadow of Delilah's ambition. Instead, he turned and led her past the barn, along a path she hadn't noticed before, one that wound through a small stand of cottonwood trees by the creek. The moon had risen, a perfect silver disk in a sea of stars, casting their long shadows before them. The only sounds were the soft crunch of their boots on the frosted ground and the gentle murmur of the creek. At the edge of the clearing stood a new structure. It was a cabin, larger than the trapper's shack she had claimed on the edge of town, built of the same sturdy, honest logs as the rest of the ranch, but with a craftsman's care she hadn't seen elsewhere. The joints were tight, the stones of the chimney were perfectly set, and a wide porch ran the length of the front, complete with a bench made from a single, smooth-planed log. A soft, warm light glowed from a window, a beacon in the cold, clear night. This was what he had been doing in his spare hours. She realized, while she was mending leather, he had been building this for them. It wasn't a sudden decision. It was a long-held hope, given form through the labor of his own hands. He stopped at the steps and turned to her, his expression serious. "I started it a month ago," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I figured a partnership needs a proper headquarters." He opened the door and stood aside, allowing her to enter first. The air inside was warm and smelled of fresh-cut pine and wood smoke from the fire crackling merrily in the large stone hearth. The single room was spacious and clean, the floor made of wide, smooth planks, not packed earth. A sturdy bed frame, large enough for 2, stood against one wall, covered with a thick patchwork quilt. There was a solid trestle table and 2 chairs, a small pantry area with shelves he had already stocked with flour and coffee, and in the corner, bathed in the firelight, was a sight that made her heart stop. It was a leatherworker's bench. It was larger and sturdier than the one at the smithy, with a full set of well-oiled tools hanging in neat, ordered rows above it. He had built a space not just for her to sleep, but for her to work. He had built a home for her soul, not just her body. She turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For the first time, they were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of an overwhelming, heart-swelling gratitude. She could not speak. Beau seemed to understand. He gently took her satchel and set it by the door. Then he unbuckled his gun belt, in a now familiar ritual. He laid the heavy belt with its holstered Colt on a small shelf near the door, a deliberate act of laying down his armor, of declaring this space a sanctuary of peace. The night was quiet. There were no demands in his eyes, no expectation in his touch. He was giving her time, letting her acclimate to the reality of this new beginning. He stirred the fire, the poker clinking softly against the stone, then came to stand before her in the center of the room. The firelight danced on the planes of his face, making him look like something carved from the very heart of the frontier strong, steadfast and true. Tonight, she did not cry. There was no tremor of fear in her hands, no instinct to shrink away from his presence. The ghost of Elias Thorne, the cold shadow of her first night, had been banished by the warmth of this fire, by the simple, profound honesty of this man. That night had been a taking. This would be a gift. Bo reached out, his calloused hands infinitely gentle, and cupped her face. He searched her eyes, a silent question passing between them. He was not asking for permission. He was asking if she was ready, if her heart was as open as his own. She gave a single, slow nod, a universe of acceptance in the small gesture. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. Instead, he took her hand and led her to the hearth. He unbuttoned his shirt, the rough wool parting to reveal the hard, muscular planes of his chest. He took her hand again, the one he had held to his heart in the stable yard, and placed it flat against his warm skin. She felt the steady, life-affirming beat beneath her palm, a rhythm that was becoming as familiar and as comforting as her own. "Tonight doesn't start anything new. Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with the depth of his feeling, his gaze holding hers with an unshakable intensity. "It just continues what we've already been building." He was right. This was not a beginning. It was a continuation. It was the roof being placed on a foundation that they had laid stone by stone, with every shared silence, every mended bridle, every act of quiet support. It was the physical expression of a partnership already forged in trust and sealed in respect. She looked at him, at this strong, quiet man who had laid down his gun, who had offered his name, who had built her a home with his own 2 hands. He had not rescued her. He had seen her strength and stood beside it, and in doing so, he had given her the one thing she never knew she needed, not a safe harbor, but an equal partner to brave the sea with. A slow, genuine smile touched her lips, the first of its kind. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was not the desperate kiss of a lonely woman, but the sure, steady kiss of a woman who was finally, truly home. And for the first time in her life, Clara Wynne allowed herself to love, not because she needed shelter from the storm, but because, after all this time, she had finally, unequivocally, been chosen. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to build a community right here, so please comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. Share your thoughts on Clara and Bo's journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video to help this story reach more listeners. Please also consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.